Dr. Filip Kovačević is on with us, and he is an author, a global justice advocate, and a university professor at the University of San Francisco, where he teaches international politics and U.S. foreign policy. He is also chairman for the NGO Movement for the Neutrality of Montenegro, and he is also involved in the politics there, and he writes for Sybil Edmonds' Boiling Frogs Post. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me yet again. I'm glad to be on your show.
It's great to have you. So you're from Montenegro, and just this past week we've been seeing these protests in Montenegro. And just for a little bit of context, we've seen in Moldova over the past few weeks, so I don't recall if it was a month or two ago, 100,000 people turn out to protest the Moldovan government and demand the resignation of the corrupt government there. And now we're seeing in Montenegro 1,000 people at least demand the resignation of the Prime Minister Milo Đjukanović. They claim he has robbed the people, destroyed jobs and the country. And, well, Đjukanović blames Moscow for the anti-government protests, which is interesting, to which Moscow has responded that he has had no evidence. And the context there is Đjukanović is pushing, he's pro-NATO, and seeking to join the NATO bloc. So what can you tell us what's happening in Montenegro?
Yeah, I mean, the situation in Montenegro is very complex. You know, we have to look at everything in a context. First of all, we have to look at the Montenegrin situation itself. What's happening in Montenegro is that Montenegro has had the same political party in power since 1990. So for 25 years, there has been only one main political party in power, led by Milo Đjukanović. So what we have in Montenegro at this point of time is pretty much the situation that one party has swallowed up the state. In other words, unless you are a member or a voter of this party, it's difficult for you to get any kind of state job, even any kind of a benefit from the state. So what we have is a highly authoritarian system. Of course, citizens are getting more and more dissatisfied with this way of running things, and steadily over the years, there has been a build-up of civic dissatisfaction with Đjukanović. And this dissatisfaction has culminated in the recent weeks. So the way I see the protest in Montenegro is pretty much through this internal dynamic that people want to live in a country that respects the rule of law, that respects democratic practices, and that respects human rights, and treats all of its citizens equally. And this is exactly not what Đjukanović is doing. In fact, over the years, he has amassed immense wealth that he is now using to lobby different centers in the West to support and sustain his illegitimate rule. If we look at the last parliamentary elections in Montenegro, which took place in October 2012, we will see that Đjukanović's party did not attain a majority, but he was able to put a coalition together using all kinds of means, including open bribery and corruption. So at this point of time, we have a highly illegitimate government that's trying to stay on the wave of geopolitics. In other words, Đjukanović has integrated the pro-NATO rhetoric, not because he cares about NATO, but because he wants to remain in power. And he has found a lot of allies in the West who do not care, even though they say they care, but in fact they do not care about the internal political dynamics in Montenegro. All they want is a leader who wants to integrate Montenegro into their bloc. So at this point of time, Đjukanović is rhetorically attacking Moscow for creating trouble in Montenegro, for supporting the opposition parties in Montenegro in order to appear more likable in the West and to get sympathy for decades of his corrupt and criminal rule.
So basically he's saying, I'm for sale, just like our friends, well, I don't know if I go so far to say Kolinda, but she from Croatia, she was the NATO secretary and a member of the Trilateral Commission, or Saakashvili over in Ukraine. So you're saying that Djukanovic is basically saying, you know, he's for sale to the West, and he's asking for them to help him remain in power.
But I mean, in addition to that, he has been in power for so many years. I mean, compared to Kolinda, Grabar-Kitarovic, and Saakashvili, he's a political dinosaur.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he has been around in Montenegro and in the Balkans since the end of the Cold War. So he has done it all. In the beginning of his rule, he was a fairly brutal Serbian nationalist, and then over the years, in order to stay in power, he switched to supporting Montenegrin independence, and now he's turning his back to his Russian allies because he has had a lot of connections with different Russian tycoon oligarch circles. So he's turning his back to his Russian allies in order to gain sympathy from the West and remain in power. So at this point of time, the West and especially the EU has to take a hard look at Montenegro, because if they continue supporting a corrupt dictator like Djukanovic, they may have a lot of trouble on their hands in Montenegro, because the majority of people are not going to take it and they are going to rebel. And in fact, what happened last weekend was tremendous police brutality that was used against peaceful demonstrators. And what we are finding out more and more is that all the attacks on the police were conducted by the groups connected to Djukanovic and to his secret police. In other words, we are dealing with a paramilitary force, the type of Gladio force that Djukanovic has organized secretly over the years in order to, at the moment of trouble, in order to get him to stay in power. So last weekend, he has ordered tremendous brutality against peaceful citizens. But thankfully, this has all been documented by various independent media and by various citizens. So we have all the video now, and it's going to be very difficult for Djukanovic to continue claiming that it was the other side, the opposition, attacking the police, the opposition trying to remove the government through violent means. In fact, he has used violent means to stay in power. Mm-hmm. So I think Djukanovic is on his way out. However, I think the problem at this point of time for the EU is what they can do so that this transition of power remains peaceful, so that we don't have anybody die as the result of a very legitimate fight for democracy and human rights in Montenegro. Djukanovic is trying, because he's immensely wealthy. He has a lot of lobbyists in the United States and in Brussels, in the EU, who will do anything to get him to stay in power. But the other side, the other factions within the EU and also the US administration should consider that it's the people who want political change, not the outside powers, not Russia or China or Serbia. Here you have a legitimate rebellion, a civic rebellion by the people.
And just real quick, I haven't researched it, but we have plenty of historical examples in the past of these paramilitary forces. So there is this evidence. You're saying video evidence and other reports that we can find online, and perhaps if I find that, I'll post it with this.
Yes, you can find that. At this point of time, I don't know whether it is in English, but videos are coming out. For instance, one video where a person is taken out of his car and beaten by about 10 to 15 police officers for no reason whatsoever, and his car is also vandalized. So this is a clear evidence of the police violently suppressing somebody who was not even at the protest in front of the parliament building. And then there are some videos that show that these paramilitaries, young men in hoods that hiding their faces, coming out of government buildings or coming into government buildings. So we have there is some empirical evidence to show that behind all of this is the government of Djukanovic. At the same time, Djukanovic is denying all of this. He is spinning out this imaginary tale that Russia is behind protests, that the Serbian nationalist circles are behind protests, in order, as I said, to get sympathy from the West. He's trying to basically play the Cold War dynamic yet again. He does not realize that by doing this, he's basically instrumentalizing the whole country and the people in it. By talking about these big geopolitical topics, he's basically endangering civic peace in Montenegro. Because we don't know how the other side is going to react. We don't know how the U.S. government and the CIA is going to react to this threat. Perhaps they'll start looking for Russian agents in Montenegro, and then we may have a proxy conflict between the Russians and the U.S. EU forces within Montenegro that the people there don't need and they don't want. All they want is democracy and the rule of law, and then to decide on a legitimate referendum whether to join NATO or not. In other words, this decision cannot be made by the Djukanovic regime because he has been so criminalized and corrupt. This decision has to be made, organized by the new government, the post-Djukanovic government, who will organize a referendum, a legitimate, a fair and free referendum on which the majority will make a decision. And I think the US and the EU should remain faithful to their rhetoric and respect the decision of the Montenegrin people. At this point of time, if you look at legitimate public opinion polls, you'll see that the majority of the people in Montenegro is against NATO membership and is in favor of the military neutrality of Montenegro. And if you look at this issue more deeply, you'll see that it actually makes a lot of sense, because within Montenegro there are many different cultures and influences. There is the Western influence, there is the Islamic influence, there is the Christian Orthodox influence. In other words, a country like Montenegro can best sustain itself if it is friendly with the West and the East at the same time.
And I was going to ask, why 2015 for these protests? And I think we were going to touch on this, but I think part of it can be the economy, no? Because I remember, if you go back to the French Revolution and all the way to the Egyptian Revolution, statistics show that when the population spends 40% of its salary on food, that will lead to revolution. So, he's been in power for 25 years. What's taking the Montenegrins so long? And is it perhaps this depression, this economic depression that we're in, where things are getting so bad that's kind of pushed them to start the protests? Or what do you think? Why 2015?
I mean, this is definitely some kind of culmination or some kind of climax. If you look at the economic situation in Montenegro, you'll find that the gap between the rich and the poor is biggest in all of Europe. So what we have there is a country that's polarized in terms of income. There are so many people at this point of time leaving Montenegro, moving to Western Europe or even to the United States in search for a better life. At the same time, we have the new class, the nouveau riche, the 1%, who are living an extremely opulent lifestyle. Sons and daughters of Djukanovic's ministers spending thousands of euros in different places at the same time that that the average salary in Montenegro is about 400 euros a month. So we basically have the socially explosive situation at the same time that we have a government that's extremely corrupt. In other words, unless you are a voter, a known voter of the ruling party, it's difficult for you to get anything from the state institutions. If you need unemployment benefits, it's difficult. If you need, let's say, if you fulfill the criteria for citizenship, it's impossible to get it unless you are the supporter of the ruling party. Whereas if you are the supporter of the ruling party, you don't even have to fulfill the criteria set in the law in order to get the citizenship. So we have immense injustice. And also we have the geopolitical injustice that I talked about earlier, that the government basically is pushing for a policy of NATO membership that the majority of the people are against. And in order to accomplish that, in order to try to sway the public, they are bombarding Montenegro with stories about the evil Russian influence and so on, the influence that's coming from outside. Whereas this is basically the idea to distract the public's mind and to scare the public. You know, the old strategy of tension that was used in Italy and France by the NATO connected Gladio warriors and by the CIA. So Đukanović controls the state media in Montenegro, and you know. The state media in Montenegro is more concerned about the situation in Belarus than it is in Montenegro. In other words, they transmitted the videos from Minsk, people demonstrating against Lukashenko, but did not transmit the videos demonstrating against Đukanović about I'd say about 500 yards for their TV station. So we are faced with a propaganda that has not been seen in Europe for a long time.
Well, let's get back to the economy in a second, but you've been mentioning NATO, and I believe your organization in Montenegro seeks to stop Montenegro from joining NATO. And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was last month where Đukanovic's government went so far as to vote on joining NATO without even an official invitation from NATO. And if we think in the context of the new Cold War, you know, whether you're pro-Russian or pro-EU, Washington or neutral, regardless, I think the rational thing to do at the very least is to not allow Montenegro to join NATO due to the military and geostrategic implications that this would have for Russia. Because, you know, we need to think in terms of the board game Risk, right? Or game theory, because, you know, it doesn't matter which side you're on. We can't allow, NATO cannot simply be allowed to go to Russia's border, just as Russia can't be allowed to go to, you know, the border with the USA. And Russia can't do anything because of the fact that it's geographically located, you know, part of Europe next to Europe's borders. So what can you tell us about the threat of NATO, Montenegro joining NATO, as well as them asking to join NATO?
You know, I'm against Montenegro being instrumentalized in these grand geopolitical schemes. You know, Montenegro should not be a piece on the grand chessboard. I approach this situation from the inside. I am looking at what is in the interest of the Montenegrin citizens, of people living in Montenegro. And coming from this perspective, you see that the best foreign policy option for Montenegro is to be militarily neutral. In other words, to have economic and political ties with the West at the same time as it is having the same kinds of ties with the East, with Russia and China. Otherwise, as I said, Montenegro itself may be in danger because different civilizations are represented, different points of view and different religions are represented within Montenegro itself. It's like a microcosm of the world. So in order to have a stable country, you basically have to please every side that's there. And in other words, being against a military alliance with the West is at the same time means that one should also be against the military alliance with the East. So that these military alliances see Montenegro as a potential friendly partner. And this can be done because even within the European Union, there are some militarily neutral countries like Austria, countries like Ireland. In fact, in our organization called the Movement for Neutrality of Montenegro, we have studied the Irish case, and we have found a lot of similarities between the situation in Ireland and the situation in Montenegro. So the way this could be accomplished is, first of all, to ask the people. In other words, there should be a new government, a government that's more open to people's concerns, the government that's going to deal with the corruption and crime that Djukanovic brought into Montenegro, which made him extremely rich and powerful. And so this new government would organize a fair referendum, and then we would get the opinion, the will of the majority. It's up to the people to decide, not to the centers in Washington, in Brussels, or in Moscow. Mm-hmm. Of course, at the same time, we are seeing people in the United States, the opinion makers in the Washington Post, and different politicians like Senator McCain, trying to instrumentalize Montenegrin situation. In other words, they're saying, we have to take Montenegro into NATO so that we can do something to Putin. So because Putin doesn't like that, we'll do that. And the same thing we hear from the other side. Just because Washington doesn't like it, we'll do it. This is something that Montenegro should not be a part of. I know it is going on and it will continue to go on. But the people of Montenegro should have the final say. And at this point of time, their say is no to NATO.
So in a sense, it would be a Switzerland of the Balkans in terms of neutrality.
It could be, yes, this could be. And in fact, in some of my work, I suggested that some of the UN institutions or even the EU institutions could move into Montenegro and could be based in Montenegro. I also suggested that, for instance, the BRICS Bank for Europe could find its seat in Montenegro. In other words, Montenegro could build up an image of a mediator. The way it is done, in the way this image is really cherished by Austria or Switzerland. So this could all be done. It of course depends on the people who are in power. And what we need in Montenegro is more intellectuals, more progressive people in power, people who will know how to use the potentials of the country in order to make life more prosperous for the people living there and also for many visitors. Because I have to say, Montenegro is a tourist destination. And you know, most foreign tourists in Montenegro are actually Russians. So the policy of Djukanovic of openly provoking Russia goes against the economic interest of Montenegro. Because Russians, having been provoked, may decide not to come to Montenegro anymore. And then the tourist industry may suffer. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, he is doing everything to stay in power. He does not care about the well-being of the people there. His geopolitical rhetoric goes completely against the interests of Montenegro. Mm-hmm. And so it seems to me that people who are observing this from the West have to take this into consideration. In other words, unless they want to have another failed state in the Balkans, and there are a few failed states in the Balkans already, unless they want to have an additional one on their hands, they have to pay more attention to what actually the people in Montenegro want.
And let's touch on one of the few remaining topics, the economy, which is all related. I've been watching lately Al Jazeera Balkans, and they've been doing a lot of episodes on Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia, and Montenegro. documenting this trend of the massive outflow or expatriation of the citizens due to the apparently shattered economies in these regions, even though some of them have joined the EU. And I remember in the Croatia episode, they cited UN statistics or projections, as well as local statistics from towns, which may be extreme, but they estimated, Croatia's population, just as an example, is around 4 million, and they said by 2020, in 5 years, they might drop down to 2.6 million. I think that's extreme, but what can you say of personal anecdotes yourself or people you know, as well as research and statistics of this trend of the whole Balkan area, which is, influences like these protests that we see in Montenegro, people just leaving the economies, joining the EU doesn't fix your economy, as well as with the immigration, if you also want to touch on how that's affecting everything.
These are extremely complex issues, but if you look at the level of political corruption, if you look at the fact that it's difficult to get a job, any job, unless you want to play along with corruption, then it's a rational choice to leave the country that's like that. So I know from my own experience, the experience of my friends, especially the young people, that they are looking for their life elsewhere. They are looking for better life elsewhere. And I'm not disputing those statistics. They may seem a little bit extreme, but the level of despair and hopelessness is very high in the Balkans. There are many political issues which have been unresolved since the wars in the Balkans 20 years ago. There are many, and there is this issue of the organized crime that has taken over some municipalities and even the whole government. I would say that the government in Montenegro is partly controlled by the organized crime in Montenegro. And the Đukanović may be the head of both. He may be the head of the government and the head of the organized crime networks in Montenegro. So a young person looking at his or her chances in Montenegro is not going to find much. So at this point, this, in my opinion, this shows the failure of the vision of whoever is running the European Union. In other words, the EU can sustain itself only as a social project. In other words, the rich countries in the EU have to think not only about their own citizens, but also about citizens of other countries in Europe. There has to be, the European Union has to be rethought. Now what we have is the Europe of neoliberalism, the Europe of the bankers. What we need to have is the Europe of the people. Or the whole thing is going to fall apart like the house of cards. Mm-hmm. And we are seeing that already in the EU inability to deal with the refugee crisis, with thousands and thousands of refugees who are coming from the Middle East. And so in my opinion, unless we have a European-wide progressive movement where we would have people from all countries unite against the oligarchy in Brussels and create a different kind of social political relations, we'll have, I think, a lot of conflict in Europe in the coming years. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the Balkans may be affected the most. So we may actually see the most trouble in the Balkans to begin with. And we are seeing some of that already with the tense relations between Croatia and Serbia over the refugee issue. In fact, some statements communicated by the Croatian leadership and by the Serbian leadership reminded me of the years of the war back in the 90s. So in other words, not much has been done on the issue of reconciliation and of coming together economically and politically of basically two peoples, the Serbs and the Croats, that share so much in common, including the language itself. So the EU has failed in the Balkans. We can say that the EU has failed. The US has also failed, even though the US focused more on some other areas of the world. And perhaps we perhaps should look at some other options. For instance, the Balkan Federation option is something that I am more and more in favor of. Not with these political elites. These political elites having been brought to power by the outside forces. They are the so-called Atlanticists. And they have been brought to power by outside forces. I'm talking about a kind of the long-term process of homegrown elites coming out of the people in the Balkans towards the idea of the Balkan Federation. In other words, the federation of the Balkan peoples, including all of the former Yugoslav peoples, together with Bulgaria and Greece and Albania. And this as a first step, this regionalism as a first step. I mean, we have to be thinking about other options because the options that we have on the table at this time are not working.
But then would you say, I mean, but then some people might say that's like bringing Yugoslavia back, or, you know, the kingdom, going back a century, the kingdom of the Slovenes, you know, Serbs or Croats. But then also, how do you, if we're already within the EU region, you create another region within, like another supranational region within?
You know, it appears at this point of time, it appears that the EU will not be expanding anymore. Mm-hmm. In other words, a part of the Balkans has been integrated, and a part of it is going to remain outside. But as you said, I mean the countries such as Slovenia and Croatia that are members of the EU are having a lot of the same economic problems that Serbia and Montenegro are having. So they pretty much come out of the same cultural and geopolitical heritage. In other words, Slovenia and Croatia have more similarities with Serbia and Montenegro than with Estonia and Latvia, mm-hmm. right? So we need to be thinking about similarities. I mean, this is a long-term project. It's just the beginning. But as I said, we have to be thinking about new imaginative options. And also we have to be thinking about Europe, not only in terms of Europe itself, but also in terms of Eurasia, in terms of Europe connecting with Russia economically, and then also with China. We have to be thinking about this continent as a whole. So what I would suggest is basically a two-level integration. But this is going to depend on new elites. This is going to depend on new ideology, on new ideas. This is going to depend on new people. Because clearly these people, the Atlanticists, they have failed. Because from the very beginning they had a hostile attitude toward Russia and toward many nations in Eurasia. Mm-hmm. So in other words, they started out as prejudiced, as antagonistic. So, and also from the other side, we also sometimes get hostile, antagonistic points of view. So what we have to come up, especially in Europe, we have to come up with a point of view that's going to of course engage the Atlanticists, but will also engage the other side, the Eurasianists. Mm-hmm. And I think China is going to play a larger role in Europe as time goes by, because China is extremely powerful economically. And I've written an article on that, which can be found on the BFP blog, which you might want to include in the show notes, where I chronicle the Chinese influence in the Balkans. And I think this will be continued. And you know, perhaps, you know, the ideas coming out of China may have, or even Russia may have kind of more capacity to deal with these issues here in the Balkans. Even though I'd say that the first step would be the talk of a Balkan Federation, and this kind of a political structure would also work at overcoming the very, very antagonistic relations between, number one, the Croats and the Serbs, and number two, the Serbs and the Albanians. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is an issue that also needs to be addressed. Mm-hmm. So, and that so long as we have the kind of the instability in Kosovo and let's say in Bosnia, we are not going to be moving Balkans into any more prosperous position.
So point one is we could be, back to the old Balkan powder keg, and second point is you're saying is these regional integration, and Sarkozy proposed, was it almost a decade ago, 7-8 years ago, the Mediterranean Union, apart from the European Union, and as you say, Putin is proposing they've already started the Eurasian Economic Union, which now they're proposing a common currency, and the way that always goes is, the end road for that is political union. So if you have a European, if you have a Mediterranean, if you got an African Union, a Eurasian Union, and so on. You can modify the Mediterranean Union to what you're saying, or switch it over.
The issue here is going to be the economic system. Is the economic system going to be more just than neoliberalism? It all comes down to that. And I would refer your viewers to the work of Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek professor and economist, and the idea that he's suggesting about how the economic system that we have today should be reformed, should be rethought. In other words, it's not enough only to talk about the geopolitical union, unless we also talk about the economic structures. Mm-hmm. Because it's how people live, it's how well people live that will determine how stable a given country or a given structure is going to be. So basically what has to be done, there has to be a new economic ideology, that combines perhaps fragments of Marxism and social democracy together with some new technologies, some new ways of looking at the world. In other words, if we could update Marxism for the 21st century, if we could remove this kind of the state-centric orientation from Marxism and bring it back to the idea of human freedom, of liberation, of the exchangeability of functions. In other words, so that I'm allowed to do one thing in the morning and the other in the afternoon. In other words, to have a system that's flexible enough to enable the fulfillment of the human individual that capitalism can never offer, because in capitalism you basically have to specialize. And also the work that you do is pretty much the energy that you put in is given to you back in terms of money, and money cannot do justice for the energy and the life work that you put into the product. Mm-hmm. So this is why capitalism leads to alienation. I mean, this is a well-known story. So otherwise, unless we do this, and this has to be done not only in the Balkans or in Europe, but all over the world, because I mean this planet has so many problems, and to come back to the issue we talked about last time in the last podcast we had together, is that we need new leadership. We need new ideology and new leadership in the world, in specific countries, and also at the global level.
Well, I'm going to have to respectfully disagree regarding the Marxism and the capitalism, because I personally adhere to the, let's say, biblical free market regulated capitalism, and definitely not the neoliberal monopoly casino hyper capitalism that we're seeing today. But I would personally respectfully disagree. But that's kind of more a philosophy. We're getting into more the philosophy.
No, but the issue is human freedom.
Right.
The issue is what, and I think we agree on this. Mm-hmm. When we say Marxism, libertarianism, and all that, there are so many connotations that go with those words that perhaps have nothing to do with the original ideas of the people who are proposing them. Mm-hmm. And I think we can agree on the issue of human freedom. And that whatever we are proposing here in this podcast and in the life beyond the podcast is that we want to enhance human freedom. Mm-hmm. And it's a fact that the system that we have today is not only not enhancing human freedom. It's actually limiting it. Many people have no freedom whatsoever because they have to work 12 to 15 hours a day. And this is happening not only in the West, but also in the East. So you have to be careful when we talk about, let's say, the Russian system, the Chinese system, and so on and so on. We have to be careful because we need to look at the individual, and let's start from the individual. And I think this is the basic impulse that we agree on, regardless of whether we agree on actual policy. But the agreement is that human freedom should be enhanced. And what I like in Marxism is the commitment to social justice. So it's not a commitment to communist manifesto of the Communist Party. It's just this impulse that existed before Marx and that now exists after Marx. In other words, social justice. In other words, that everybody is treated fairly, and that people are not taking advantage of their own special talents and abilities. In other words, that we have some kind of a social consciousness. So let's say if I can do something well, then I perhaps should have an idea in my consciousness to share the wealth that I have with other people, the wealth that I have made with other people. And so in my opinion, a new ideology, or many new ideologies that we'll have in the 21st century, have to emphasize this aspect, the aspect of our common humanity. No matter what race or nationality or ethnicity we are, or identity, sexual or otherwise, we are all human beings, and we may be faced with challenges that only together we can overcome. Issues like the man-made climate change and many other issues facing the planet.
And let's finish up with the topic of the crisis of immigration. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands are now passing through the Balkans to get to the West, France, Germany, Scandinavian countries, Britain. And recently the former Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, he called it a catastrophic error. And it's funny, I was speaking to my German colleague here, and I was saying that if the way things continue the way they are continuing with the immigration, that Europe will fundamentally be changed forever. The Europe as we know it will never be the same with so many of these refugees. And Abbott recently stated that the tide of humanity surging through Europe and that they will quite possibly change it forever. So what are your thoughts on the immigration crisis?
It's a horrible tragedy. This issue has so many different aspects. We also, I think, have to look at perhaps long-term historical context. Perhaps what's happening in the Middle East and in Europe at this point of time with the refugee crisis is not only political or economic. It may be a component of some kind of a long-term population movement. The way we read in the history books about the coming of the Slavs to the Balkan Peninsula in the 8th century. Perhaps it's comparable to that. And I think this should be welcome. I mean, so what? Europe is not going to be the same again. But so what? I mean, the Europe that we had so far wasn't that great either. I mean, if you look at the pain and the suffering in the world within the last 200 years, it was generally caused by the European powers. Think about the British and the French colonialism. Think about what Belgium did in Congo and in other parts of Africa. So in other words, so what? Europe is going to be different. It may be a better Europe. These people coming into Europe may enrich Europe in many different ways. And in fact, they will. They will, because there are demographic reasons. If you look at the statistics, the average age in today's European Union by 2050 is going to be 55 years old. It's going to be 55 years. So in other words, this is, it may be needed, it may be how it should be. In other words, national boundaries, if you look at them, have been set up artificially. I mean, look at the boundaries in Africa or in the Middle East or even in the Balkans. I mean, who drew these boundaries? Who said this is going to be Serbia, this is going to be Croatia? It's all artificially done. So I think perhaps I hope this refugee crisis will lead the Europeans and the European leaders to like face the basic humanity. I'm afraid that this is not going to happen. I'm afraid that what you'll see in Europe is the rise of xenophobia, the anti-immigrant feeling, the parties openly rejecting the immigrants for many different reasons. But this is all wrong. This will lead to, because the immigrants are going to be a political force too. We may be talking about millions of people, and they will be a political force in Europe. In other words, they can organize and they can set up their own towns and everything. So in other words, I welcome this. And it may not be, of course, the immediate cause of it are the wars in the Middle East conducted by different Western powers. But it could also be related to climate change or perhaps movements of the populations that happen occasionally. And I think we have to welcome them. And this is going to be difficult. This is going to be difficult for many Europeans, but it is necessary. Because think about Europe itself. Think about how many refugees there were in Europe after World War II. Think about many of these countries accepting the European refugees. Think about how many European refugees escaped to Syria or Egypt or during World War II, and they were safe. They were safe there. So in other words, this is a fact, and it is not going to get. The refugees are not going to stop coming. In fact, what's going to happen? We will have even more people in Europe by the beginning of next year. If you look at the figures now, you'll see that the numbers are increasing. Some people said, well, in winter time, the number typically decreases. But this is not your typical refugee crisis. This is something much bigger. So what I'm saying is, Europe, you are changing, you have to change. And you integrate these people. These people should be welcomed. The borders should be open, and they should be let in. What is the alternative? They're not gonna go back. And even once there is peace there, they may decide to stay in Europe. And so what? They will enrich Europe because they have a lot of talent and energy. And even if they don't, they are human beings and they should be taken in.
Okay. Well, Dr. Filip Kovačević, we've run a good hour. So thank you for your time again. You are a professor at the University of San Francisco of International Politics and U.S. Foreign Policy, a global justice advocate, and chairman of the NGO Movement for Neutrality of Montenegro, as well as you write for Sybil Edmonds' Boiling Frogs Post. And always good to have you on.
Thank you very much for your invitation.